to have fun, learning to fly, learning to run. I let my heart decide the way when I was young. Deep down, I must have always known that this would be inevitable. To earn my stripes, I'd have to pay and bare my soul. I know I'm not the only one who regrets the things they've done. Sometimes I just feel it's only me who can stand the reflection that they see. I wish I could live a little more, look up to the sky, not just the floor. I feel like my life is flashing by, and all I can do is watch and cry. I miss the air, I miss my friends, I miss my mother, I miss it when life was a party to be thrown, but that was a million years ago. When I walk around all of the streets where I grew up and found my feet, they can't look me in the eye. It's like they're scared of me. I try to think of things to say, like a joke or a memory, but they don't recognize me now in the light of day. I know I'm not the only one who regrets the things they've done. Sometimes I just feel
At this time, we would like to ask you to take a seat. We're going to start shortly. Thank you. Hello, Berea beloved. My name is Edward Chabano, and I am an international student from the Republic of Moldova. I'm a junior double major in political science and economics, and today I have the honor to introduce our next Begley Van Cleve Convocation speaker. However, out of respect for our speaker and all audience members, I would ask everyone present to turn off all their electronic devices, such as smartphones, laptops, tablets, for the entire duration of this convocation. Also, we are still battling the COVID-19 pandemic, so don't forget to stay masked while attending this convocation. And now, I would like to talk more about our convocation speaker, Dr. Hudson. Dr. Valerie Hudson is an expert on international security and foreign policy analysis, as well as gender and security. Now, Dr. Hudson directs the program Women, Peace, and Security at Texas A&M University, Bush School of Government and Public Service. In 2009, Foreign Policy named her as one of the top 100 most influential global thinkers. Her co-authored book, Berea Branches, Security Implications of Asia's Surplus of Male Population, and the research it presents, received major attention from the media with coverage in Wall Street Journal, New York Times, BBC, CNN, and numerous other outlets. She was also recently named a Distinguished Scholar of Foreign Policy Analysis by the International Studies Association. Dr. Hudson has developed a nation-by-nation database on women called the Women's Stats Database that has triggered both academic and policy interest. She has received significant research grants, including grants from the US Department of State, of Defense, Minerva Initiative, and the National Science Foundation to support her work in international affairs. She was also Fulbright Distinguished Chair at the Australian National University in early 2017. Dr. Hudson served as Vice President of the International Studies Association for 2011 and 2012. She's a founding editorial board member of Foreign Policy Analysis and also serves on the editorial boards of the American Political Science Review, Politics and Gender, the American Journal of Political Science, and International Studies Review. And now, without further delay, please give a warm welcome to our Begley Van Cleve speaker, Dr. Valerie Hudson.
Where's the on switch? All right, can you hear me now? Oh, now they've turned it on. Okay. Right, I guess we have it now. All right. All right, I am delighted. Work. Okay, great. Gotcha. All right. I have been floored by the beauty of this campus. I have been stunned by the incredibly innovative model of education Berea College has. And then in my meeting with students this afternoon, I was gobsmacked at what intelligent bright students Berea College has. So all in all, I am totally impressed. I'm really glad to be here. So let's have a great time together today. I'm here to talk with you about on the relationship between what's going on with women and what's going on with nation states. All right, let's see here. Hold on. I've got to turn the power on this sucker to, power on. Yes, yes, okay. If you're interested in learning more after this presentation, I would steer you towards this book upon which the address is based. It's called The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll be like, duh, of course sex shapes governance and national security worldwide. But in the meantime, let's take that journey to see how that's so. All right. Now, what I would suggest, and this is not new at all, right, is that if we're talking about politics within a society, then I would assert that the very first political order in any society is established between the two halves of the human race, male and female. And that unless they find a way to coexist and cooperate with one another, there isn't going to be a future. There literally will not be a future to this society. And furthermore, I would argue, as have other scholars before me, that the character of those relationships, the relationships between men and women within a given society, is going to shape lots, all right? The structure of that society is going to influence many, many, many things within the society. And I want to talk about tonight what those effects are going to be. So sometimes I play a little game with my students, and I say, well, let's pretend we're in a video design class. I want you to make a game. And the only information I'm going to give you is there has to be at least two groups, roughly half of the players. And if they don't cooperate, there's no second round. And I say, go for it. Make me a game. And they're like, wait, we can't make you a game. You've got to tell us more. And I say, all right, what do you want to know? And then they ask me questions that turn out to all be deeply political in nature. They ask me, well, how do these two groups relate? Are they like equals, or is one above another? What's the status there? They ask me how decisions for the group are made. Right? Do they have to agree on what to do next, or can one group kind of decide for the other? If there's conflict between the two groups, how is that conflict to be resolved? Is it going to be resolved peacefully or by coercion and force? And then lastly, the most political of all questions, how are resources distributed between these two groups? Whatever is considered valuable in the society, whether it be food or children or gold or cattle, right? Who's got the preponderance of those? I say, yes, you've got it now, right? What I'm talking about is male-female relations, and every question you've just asked me is a question about what the political order between men and women are. Now, when I first began this research decades ago, I thought to myself that the best indicators of what kind of political order existed between men and women would be to look at indicators that are often used in the research literature, such as female literacy, female labor force participation, female representation in parliament. And that was something that I held on to until about a dozen years ago. And about a dozen years ago at my university, we were hosting some of the female Loya Jirga members. These are female members of the Afghan parliament. There are not going to be any more female members of the Loya Jirga. So this was a really special group of women. I was assigned to be hostess to a particular member of parliament during lunch. and trying to make conversation, trying to bridge the gap. I said, well, you know, this is just a real turning point for Afghanistan. I said, here you are, you're university educated, you're a medical doctor, now you're a member of parliament. You know, Afghan women are really becoming empowered. And she chuckled softly and she said, Valerie, you don't understand. She said, I could go home today and my husband could divorce me by saying, I divorce you 3 times. And if he divorced me, I would have nowhere to go and nowhere to live because my father's family would not take me back because of the dishonor. And if he divorced me, I would not have custody of my children because the custody of the children would go to my husband. And she said, even if I'm not divorced by my husband, I may have very little say in when my children marry or who they marry. So how empowered am I really, Valerie? And that was kind of a real light bulb moment for me. And I began to look into it more. And I discovered that you can have really high levels of female literacy in societies where women are subordinated. Saudi Arabia is an example of that. You can have really high rates of female labor force participation in societies where women face serious obstacles, such as the Philippines. You can have really high proportions of women in the parliament. In fact, you could have the highest proportion of women in parliament in the world at 61%. And women could be seriously subordinated, as they are in Rwanda. So I began to think, well, where would I look then? Where would I look to really see the first political order between men and women in a society? And I felt that female parliamentarian's response gave me the clue. And the clue that I needed was, what's going on with the woman in her household? That's going to tell me in a much more direct fashion whether she is subordinated or not. So questions like, how much say does a woman have about getting married? And how old is she typically when she's married? How much say does a woman have within the marriage? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have in their households? Are there inequalities in family law, such as my female parliamentarian told me about divorce law and custody law? Is marriage patrilocal, where the bride moves to the groom's family's compound? Are bride price or dowry paid? Bride price is where the groom's family pays the bride's family to contract the marriage. Dowry is where the bride's family pays the groom's family to contract the marriage. Do we find prevalent polygyny, that is, marrying more than one woman? Do we find prevalent cousin marriage? Does the society view domestic violence and even the killing of women as normal, even expected, even at sometimes obligatory? Okay? All of these things, really ground-level things about what's going on in a woman's life, is going to tell us what kind of first political order we're seeing. So my colleagues and I developed this diagram here, which kind of shows that we think of this as kind of a syndrome, an interlocking syndrome of types of things. So for example, starting from the top left, you know, how willing are males to use violence and force to get what they want in the society, right? How willing are they to coerce females? And then who controls the resources, right? So is it the patriline? Is it the father's line that controls the resources? Or are resources shared between men and women? Do we have patrilineality and patrilocal marriage, as I just described? Because when we do, we start to see son preference arising, where families, both parents, place more value on sons than on daughters, because sons carry on the family line and are considered family, whereas daughters are going to be marrying out. As a result of son preference, we often see a deep devaluation of the lives of daughters and wives. In particular, one outcome is a depressed marriage age for girls, where girls may be married right around puberty, 12, 13, 14, sometimes 15 and 16. And this also begins to develop kind of this deep inequity between men and women in family and personal status laws. So inheritance, property rights, divorce, child custody, and so forth are often highly inequitable between men and women. And then coming up the left-hand side here, we find that there's kind of two approaches in terms of various customs, depending upon whether women's productive labor is considered very valuable within the society. So if it is, what we usually see develop is a culture that has both bride price and polygyny, okay, where women are viewed as valuable workers and rich men can accumulate more through their wealth by paying bride price. If women's labor, productive labor, is not considered very valuable within the society, we usually end up with what you're seeing in India, which is a dowry society where the bride's family has to pay the groom's family, as well as severe sex ratio alteration. That is, girls are seen as a terrible, terrible burden, and so sex-selective abortion and female infanticide may be rife. Well, fascinatingly, these things kind of hold together. Usually when you have one or two, you end up with 3 or 4 or 5. They all tend to interlink together in this kind of syndrome. And we would like to suggest, and where we go with this, is that this syndrome is monstrous, right? That is, it will eat up not just women, but children and men and whole societies, and mire them in terrible national or group outcomes in terms of health, in terms of wealth, in terms of security, in terms of the environment, you name it. That kind of first political order portends poor outcomes for the nation. Now, this syndrome, as we've said, is really a trap, because what it does, in essence, is it means that your society will be governed by male-bonded groups, usually kin groups, right? But it can also be larger fraternities of men as well. We believe that governance by extended male kin networks leads to unfortunate outcomes for the group: instability, violence, terror, corruption, autocracy. Why? Because that's the foundation it's built on in the first political order. That is to say, male-female relations are built on domestic terror, domestic violence, domestic autocracy, domestic corruption, domestic exploitation. So these things get exported from the household to the larger society through male kin rule. Furthermore, we believe that such a society will also experience consequences, not just in terms of security, but in terms of poor health, food insecurity, low economic performance, economic rentierism, demographic woes, and lack of attention to environmental security. In many cases, this is because some of these things are highly, highly gendered. For example, the health of the family is often assigned as a role to women. So if you disempower women, you're going to be disempowering your family's ability to have good health outcomes, which then multiplies over the households within the society. So if there's any takeaway that I want you to bring with you from this presentation, it's that what you do to your women is what you do to your nation state, okay? Your choice of first political order is going to lead in very predictable ways to either good fortune or ill fortune for your nation. Now, the Defense Department was kind enough to give us about $1.3 million to see if there was anything to this. So we spent 4 years undertaking a really intensive data search in order to characterize each of the nations on the variables in that circular syndrome that I pointed out to you previously. And we did. Oh boy, what a slog that was. And mapping it, you can see that there is, in fact, a very distinct kind of geographical difference between some of the areas and where they wind up in terms of these subordinative practices like polygyny and cousin marriage and so forth. All right, so what I'd like to explain now is why what you do to your women affects your nation state. Sometimes the links are immediate and proximate. They're really easy to see, especially if you live within this society. And the example that I would like to give you of those immediate links is how bride price figures into international security. And this is one of those interesting links that has been completely overlooked by Western security studies. And only recently been understood to be a cause of conflict and terror and insurrection around the world. We've talked about what bride price is. It's the price a groom's family pays to the bride's family to contract the marriage. So understand that over time in bride price societies, there usually develops kind of a going rate for the average bride. At the elite levels, the very elite levels, the bride prices may be very, very high. At the very, very, bottom levels, there may be a different price. But usually for the bulk of the society, there's kind of a going rate for a bride. So this acts as kind of a universal flat tax on young men in the society. And as we all know, flat taxes tend to be very regressive. They're going to hit the poor much harder than they are going to hit those who are more well off. Unfortunately, bride prices tend to do something that real estate prices tend to do, and that is they tend to bubble up over time. That is, they are prone to swift, even dramatic inflation over time, as each father is looking at each other father to see if they can raise bride price just a little. And as they do, it raises for the whole community, just like housing costs. So surging bride prices are also linked to polygyny, because when bride prices begin to get higher, then rich men are often the only ones who can afford to buy brides. And they buy them to add them to their stable of wives. So polygyny, the rate of polygyny may actually increase as bride price surges. So what happens then is that many young men facing a marriage market in which bride price is completely out of range for them find themselves in a deep sense of frustration and grievance. In this kind of society, their only ability to get ahead is to be married and to begin to have sons themselves and find their place within the patrilineal organization. If they can't get married, they can't do that and will be forever viewed more as a teenager than a fully adult male. So you get this deep, abiding sense of frustration. And what happens is you get a significant delay of marriage age among men, or sometimes marriage is even impossible for men. For example, on the eve of the Arab uprising, the average age of marriage for men in Egypt was 33, because it took so long for young men to build up enough cash and other goods to pay the going rate for a bride. Now, I think you can probably intuit what's going to happen next is that rebel groups, terror groups, insurrectionist movements, all sorts of interesting actors begin to say, we could use this. This is really to our benefit. And so they begin to openly attempt to recruit these young men who have been priced out of the marriage market, assuming that the young men will join their cause. Well, one excellent example of this is Boko Haram. I'm sure that you're aware of their activities in northern Nigeria and how they've been involved in kidnapping schoolgirls over the years. But what's part of the story that is not often told in the West is that there was a huge jump in bride price in northern Nigeria in the early 2000s when Boko Haram began to form. And that Boko Haram uses the high bride price as a recruiting tool. That is to say, you'll notice that they tend to specialize in abducting schoolgirls, right? And they often are abducting schoolgirls as a recruitment tool and offer them as wives to their own fighters. When these girls are abducted, something that the Western press also did not notice is that a token bride price is almost always left behind, which serves to legitimate the marriage, even though it was not a marriage of consent. In this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge, explained one young woman who had been abducted. Usually, it is very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now. This same kind of situation where inflationary bride price has led to a surge in rebel and terror activities has also been noted in places such as South Sudan, in Pakistan, and in Timor-Leste. I think any of you who are students of the ISIS caliphate in Iraq know that one of the ways they recruited foreign fighters was to offer to give them a bride price or even to give them a bride if they came and fought for ISIS. More recently, the Taliban is doing the same. When they took over Kabul, we were in the midst of trying to get some of our Bush School students out. And one of our Bush School students said that she needed to stay and take care of her elderly parents. So you're like, okay, just let us know if anything changes. Well, about a month later, 1 month later, she got in contact with us and she said, we have to leave. I have to leave now. My family wants me to leave now. And she sent us a screenshot of the proclamation that had been posted all throughout the streets of Kabul, which is that any woman who was over 20 and unmarried and any widow under age 35 would need to be married immediately, or she would be given to one of the Taliban fighters as a bride. And the Taliban began going door by door to find these women. So we managed to extract her. It was very perilous. I'm so glad she made it out. But this is something that is real, all right? This is something that definitely is part and parcel of the kinds of insecurity that we're seeing these days. All right, sometimes the links between the first political order and security and insecurity are more longer term and structural, not quite as immediate and proximate. And here I would probably point you to the example of the increasing masculinization of the world's population. Now, normally speaking, the overall sex ratio of a population that's not practicing anything like sex-selective abortion or female infanticide tends to be 98 men per 100 women because women tend to live longer than men. However, these days, the male to female global sex ratio is over 101.8, which means that tens, even hundreds of million women have to be missing for that kind of alteration to take place. And in fact, the number of nations that have abnormal sex ratios is actually increasing, not decreasing over time. When I first started studying this issue, in 1990, we could only find 5 countries that had abnormal birth-sex ratios, and 2 of them basically belonged to China. One was Hong Kong and one was Macau. But in the current day, now, I think as of 2020, we have 18 of them. 18 of them, and they are not confined to East Asia. So we have Afghanistan, Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Notice this is crossing not just regional boundaries, but religious boundaries as well. Armenia is Christian, Azerbaijan is Muslim. China, Georgia, Hong Kong, India, Kosovo, Montenegro, Nepal, North Macedonia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Samoa, Serbia, Taiwan, and Vietnam. All right? So this ancient practice of culling girls from the birth population because males are so much more valuable than females, right, is actually spreading over the 21st century. Not contracting, but spreading. It's also true that migrant flows can affect sex ratios in a very significant way. For example, in 2015, when we had that first huge wave of migration into Europe, nations took various different approaches to that. Some kept the migrants out, like Hungary. Others accepted a certain number of migrants. But Sweden, being, God bless the Swedes, opened their doors and said, whoever can come, come. So a huge number of people, disproportionate number of people compared to other European countries, went to Sweden. And the first wave of any migration flow is almost always young adult males who are seen as being able to better withstand the rigors of the migration. And they're going to go and sort of set up shop and then hopefully bring the rest of their family members with them. So about 85% of the migrants that showed up to Sweden, I think it was actually 87%, were young adult men. And then Sweden did something that they have since regretted and undone. They said, if you're under 18, we will never deport you for any reason whatsoever. And so virtually all the young adult men who could said that they were 16 or 17. And no medical checks were done. I can assure you the Swedes have totally changed all of this. Now there's medical checks, there's all sorts of things that go on. But back then they were like, yep, if you're under 18, we won't deport you. So most of them claimed to be 16 or 17. And so the very next year, when Sweden counted heads, it discovered that among the 16 to 17-year-old population in its country, it had 123 men per every 100 women, which was actually far worse than the People's Republic of China that had only 117 men aged 16 to 17 per 100 women. So Sweden now has a drastically altered sex ratio among its young adults because of migration. All right, well, what happens when you get a masculinized sex ratio within your society? That is, you have many more men, usually young adult men, than you have women within your society. Well, there's actually a really burgeoning corpus of literature asking that very question. And what is found, and this is cross-national in terms of findings, is that you get much higher crime rates and much higher political protest rates within a society. Furthermore, you get that very same marriage market obstruction that we were just talking about with reference to Nigeria. But now the cause isn't bride price. Now the cause is there actually physically aren't enough women to marry the men in the society. So it acts in the very same way as a structural goad, if you will, leading young men to join groups. And these could be criminal gangs, could be terror groups, insurrectionist groups that offer them extra cash. Resources well beyond that they could hope to gain in any other legal way. The crimes that increase particularly include crimes against women, including trafficking and forced prostitution. China is still currently the largest nation on earth and has the most abnormal sex ratio overall of all the countries on earth. So China's actually acted as a large sucking sound, drawing women in from all the surrounding countries. In fact, one of my colleagues, who's an expert on North Korea, once said that the biggest export from North Korea to China is women. But that can also be said of places like Vietnam and Laos and Burma and others as well. So women are trafficked in either as prostitutes or as quote unquote brides for men. Now, because of this kind of chattel market in women, oftentimes that plus the rising crime rates against women mean that you're going to get mobility restrictions on women that you didn't see before. And certainly one of the big feminist issues of Western Europe now in countries like Sweden is that with the masculinized sex ratio, women are feeling that they are not as safe in the public square as they used to be. They now constrain their movements so that they can be safer. So mobility restriction, I think, is also very important. HIV and STD spread is significantly higher in countries with masculinized sex ratios than without, probably because of a growing prostitution issue. And there may also be an altered calculus of deterrence. Oftentimes, we talk about how countries like the United States or Israel are very, very sensitive to wars of attrition. That is, long, drawn-out wars that, in which men are dying, every week, every month, over years of time. And a lot of national security strategies based around avoiding wars of attrition like the plague. And this allows for mutual deterrence of countries that would not want to see these types of attrition warfare situations develop. But when you have a highly masculinized sex ratio, a war of attrition looks very different to you. Now it looks like not just a challenge, but perhaps also an opportunity, okay, to work with those highly abnormal sex ratios and perhaps make them more normal over time. So we suggest that it would be harder to deter a nation with a masculinized sex ratio from fighting a war of attrition. And I think that needs to be kept in mind as we talk about coming scenarios concerning possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The US is not prepared to undertake a war of attrition, but it may well be that China is prepared to undertake a war of attrition. And that needs to be kept in mind. All right, so you're like, okay, we like the examples, Professor Hudson. Do we have any statistical evidence? Well, that's exactly what the Defense Department paid for, was to gather enough data so that we could do the most comprehensive statistical analysis to see if there was any significant relationship between the subordination of women, in that syndrome-like first political order or not. So we operationalized the syndrome, as I suggested, and then we used multivariate regression, holding 7 variables constant, and we examined 9 dimensions of nation-state outcomes. We looked at indicators surrounding political stability and governance, indicators around security and conflict, including terror. We looked at economic performance, economic rentierism, health and well-being, demographic security, education, social progress, and environmental preservation. And because we wanted to make sure that no one thought these were sort of borderline types of results, if any of you have had to take statistics, we chose a very rigorous cutoff for statistical significance. Usually in the social sciences, and again, if you don't know what this means, don't worry about it. Usually in the social sciences, we look at significance at the 0.05 or 0.01 level. In our case, we chose a 0.001 level so that there could be no quibbling over whether our results were significant or not. We also looked at 161 different outcome variables. Again, we wanted this to be the most comprehensive and most robust analysis. And again, we did not want people saying, well, if you'd chosen these different indicators, you would have seen something different. No. So we wanted to have tens of variables for each of the 9 clusters of nation-state outcomes so that there could be no sense that we had cherry-picked these results. All right. So what were our findings? You can imagine that when we handed it off to our co-author, who was the statistician, we were all just, gnawing at our nails, wondering what was going to happen, were we going to find any of these linkages to be significant or not? And we were blown away. We were blown away. So looking at political instability and freedom and autocracy, the syndrome was significant in 93% of the runs that we did. For conflict and insecurity, 75% of the runs. Measures of political terror, 80% of the runs. Economic performance, 62% of the runs. Public health and well-being, 71%. Environmental preservation, 85%. Demographic security, 70%. Educational attainment, 60%. Social progress, 75%. Overall, over all of those 161 outcome measures that look at all the various dimensions of national security, whether you subordinate women at the household level was highly significant in 71.3% of the models. All right, so this is extremely important to look at. No matter whether you're interested in security, in governance, economic performance, you have to look at what's happening with women. Because what you do to your women, you do to your nation state. If you curse your women, then you curse your nation state. Consider the odds. Some folks like odds ratios instead of multiple regression results. Maybe they're gamblers. So we ran some logistic regressions as well. And what we found is that with each step worse on the syndrome scale, you were twice as likely to be a fragile state, 3.5 times more likely to have a government that was autocratic, less effective, and more corrupt. 1.5 times the chance of being unstable and violent. 1.28 times the chance of experiencing terrorism. 1.4 times the chance of your country being poor and in economic decline. 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita. 1.5 times the chance of having low environmental quality. Almost twice the chance of having a high fertility rate. Almost twice the chance of a higher incident of preventable deaths. Almost twice the chance of being food insecure. Right, of scoring worse on the global hunger index. And that's not for having the top one, that's for every step worse you take. Your odds go up and up and up. That first political order really is determinative of what the horizon is for your country. Rose McDermott said about our findings, the findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention. So I am sure in your political science and IR classes here at Berea College, this is not overlooked. I know your Professor McGee, and I am sure that she tells you about these things. But I can tell you that in many, many colleges and universities around the country, you will have a womanless look at national security and IR theory, right? They won't even be included in the syllabus. And yet they are one of the most determinative factors that you could possibly look at. Why did we get these results? In a theoretical sense, I think there are several causal pathways here that we have to talk about. One, I think absolutely the first political order is a boot camp. Right? So there is no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption and exploitation, lived domestic autocracy. All right? If the children of your society are being raised in households that have those characteristics, they are completely normalized to them. In fact, they will be seen as the natural way to govern, the natural way of conflict resolution, the natural way of economic life. Secondly, what we've already talked about is that aspects of the syndrome, such as bride price, such as sex ratios, also create these chronic structural catalysts or goads, right, to engaging in political violence. So these things are like taking your stool and sawing off one of the three legs. It's never going to be stable. You have built into the structure of that thing a deep instability that can never be erased. That's part of the problem as well. And then lastly, of course, you're disempowering women, the very people who weave the web of life in every community, who tend to the young, who tend to the sick, who tend to the elderly because of gender role assignment, all right? They are also the ones who benefit the least when men go to war, right, or perpetrate terror. And so you're actually muting the half of your population that would say no to many of these things. So usually when I give these research findings, many times I'm giving them actually at the Defense Department. Sometimes folks in the audience have never really thought about it this way before. So I help them. I say, do you consider yourself a national security realist? And they all nod, right? Because would you be admitting to be a national security unrealist, surrealist, idealist? No, not in the Defense Department. So yeah, they're all national security realists. And I say, well, in light of these empirical findings, are you a realist if you believe the treatment of women affects the security, stability, governance, resilience, health, wealth, demography, education, and social progress of a nation? Now remember, one of the core tenets of realism is that you look at the world the way it really is. So yeah, if they're a realist, they're like, okay, yeah, I believe. So are you a realist if you believe then that the Defense Department ought to be fully on board with a women, peace, and security agenda that looks at women's perspectives, women's concerns, women's priorities when we're talking about national security? And, reluctantly, the heads nod. And then I ask them, look, can you call yourself a realist if you don't? Yeah, no, you can't. So this is something that if you really style yourself as a national security realist, you would be interested in. All right, so at that point, my DoD audience is usually asking, yeah, but what would change? Nothing would really change, would it? So I say, well, let's think about it. If the US is not tracking the situation of women, especially at the household level, what kind of situational awareness is it going to have, right? How is it going to have an effective foreign policy? How will it accurately anticipate instability in other countries if it's unaware of linkages related to syndrome components such as bride price and polygyny, right? And in fact, when we interview folks who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, we find that those who were in command positions on the ground got it. They knew the linkage between bride price and insurrection because every spring was not only fighting season, it was marriage season. And if the men couldn't get married because they couldn't afford the bride price, they joined the Taliban and joined fighting season. So they could actually figure out how many Taliban they were going to face depending upon how high the bride price was in a given area. How will the US decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if it doesn't first examine how each treats women before making a commitment? And of course, the archetypal example here is Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, all right, when the Mujahideen were fighting the Soviets. Right? We went with the Mujahideen, which in hindsight probably may have been a big mistake. But the Mujahideen were very open. They did not want their daughters educated, as the Soviets insisted. They did not want women to play any role in governance, as the Soviets insisted. They did not want there to be a minimum age of marriage, as the Soviets insisted. In a sense, then, we were backing the side that promised to treat women the worst. That was a big mistake, right? And I think we've repeated that mistake subsequently. I could tell you some things about Syria. How will the U.S. avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make peace between warlords if it doesn't understand the linkage between sustainable peace and the empowerment of women? You can't make peace over the bodies of women. It's not going to be a peace. Afghanistan is not going to be at peace because it has bargained away all the rights of its women, right? So, not good. How would the U.S. track which of its own citizens are the greatest internal threat if domestic violence is not taken seriously? I'm sure you're aware there's some really persuasive empirical research that shows that our domestic terrorists, our domestic mass shooters are, to a man, and let's face it, 97% of them are male, to a man have been accused or arrested or convicted in their past of domestic violence against a woman, a mother, a sister, a girlfriend, a wife, an ex-girlfriend, an ex-wife. All right? There is an interesting and tight link between misogyny and violence against women and willingness to use political violence to hurt others within the community. And yet we still treat domestic violence as some sort of lesser, unremarkable crime when it should be a huge warning flag. How will the U.S. rationally approach immigration policy if it does not comprehend that the true clash of civilizations is not about religion or ethnicity, but it's about the subordination of women? How will it understand that tolerating enclaves of family and personal status law that subordinate women will destabilize its society? All right, this is something that nations like Norway and Australia have really wrestled with. You know, they're taking in a number of young adult men from societies, and it doesn't matter where the society is, but societies where women are treated very, very badly. And so they've made extra efforts to try to educate these young men that women cannot be treated in the country to which they've emigrated to in the same way as they were at home. Australia, for example, actually now has questions on its citizenship test. Is female genital cutting legal in Australia? Yes, no. Is it legal under Australian law to arrange a marriage for your daughter? Yes, no. Is it legal in Australia to beat your wife? Yes, no. Now, of course, critics have said, well, they're just going to lie. They're just going to say the answer you know they know you want them to say. And the Australian authorities say that's not the point. The point is that they know, and the women know, that these things are illegal, and that the women can seek help for these kinds of situations. Canada has taken a different approach. Canada will not admit asylum seekers who are young, unaccompanied males, period, end of. Unless they're with a family unit, they cannot seek asylum in Canada. So I think nations are sort of cluing in here that they have an interesting opportunity to try to prevent the subordination of women from taking hold in their own countries. How will the U.S. know that ending child marriage worldwide would probably do more for world peace than almost any other investment? That's true. I've actually done the research. And child marriage is one of the best predictors of a terrible outcome for your country. High levels of child marriage go one-on-one with being at the bottom of virtually every outcome for a country. And yet, what do we spend our money on? Democracy programs. Maybe we should be spending the money on eliminating child marriage instead and see if democracy grows from that, which I think it would. How will the US know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't? Okay, you can't veneer democracy on top of a first political order that deeply subordinates women. That doesn't make any sense. All right? You're not going to have a viable democracy. It'll be at most an illiberal democracy, an insincere democracy. So I really think that we need to take a look at what's going on with women even when we think about democratization. All right, so I believe one day the idea that foreign policy or national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be seen as laughably naive. I really do believe that within 20, 30 years' time, you will not see professors teaching IR theory as if there were no women on the planet Earth. All right, they'll be teaching it like Professor McKee teaches it. All right, where could we intervene? Well, I think there's a number of places we could intervene, and if you're interested in the Q&A, I'd be happy to go into this diagram where we could talk about change. But in conclusion, I'd like us to sort of rethink national security, all right? Given everything we've just talked about, I really do believe that Hillary Clinton in 2012, when she was Secretary of State, hit the nail on the head when she said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country." She is absolutely right. It is a threat. And so disrupting the weak points of the subordination of women may actually be foundational to undercutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance. All right. That's all I have. If you want to know anything about our data, our methods, please check out our website at womenstats.org. We have actually the largest database on the situation of women worldwide. So enjoy that. I look forward to your questions. Oh, goody, people are coming up. That's wonderful. I somehow lost that other battery. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name's Athena. I'm a peace and social justice major and a psychology major.
Yeah.
And so I was listening to your talk. I was wondering, what do you think the role of legalization, decriminalization of sex work is in these sorts of situations, and how it might help or harm?
That's an excellent question. I'm so glad that you raised it. I think that's one of the burning questions of today. Not just that, but also I think pornography, right? Because as a society, what we are saying is that we will allow men to buy the bodies of women and use them as they see fit. And I think terms like pornography and sex work obscure the hugely gendered nature of these things, right? 97% of consumers of prostitution are men, right? Something like 88% of all those in prostitution are women. So this is not some sort of gender-neutral question. This is a deeply gendered question. I tend to take an abolitionist stance on sex work because despite the fact that it might make sense for a particular woman, what it does for the entire class of women is suggests impunity for what should be considered rape and sexual slavery of women. And so I would prefer an approach that provides services to those who have been involved in prostitution and in trafficking, and allows them to find a living that does not mean their exploitation. I love what Iceland did several years ago. Iceland finally completely banned prostitution. And the announcement by the government was, today we tell the men of Iceland that no Iceland woman is for sale, not to any man at any time for any price. And I think that does a lot of good for the first political order of a given society. Thank you. That's a brilliant question.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Hi, I know you.
Hi,
don't
yes,
I?
we had lunch together earlier.
Matthew, are you Matthew?
Matthew, yes. So for my foreign policy analysis class, I actually did a presentation over women, peace, and security.
Did
and
you?
I did. And something that I heard a lot, like in the research that I found, was that they kept on saying, put women in positions of power, put women in positions of power. But what exactly does that look like? Because as you mentioned earlier, like in the case of Rwanda, there's a lot of parliamentarians who are women, but they're extremely subjugated. So are we putting women in the wrong positions of power? Should we be putting women in like the judiciary as judges, appointing more female judges, or what exactly should that look like, do you think?
That's a brilliant question. It's one that I've deeply thought about. Now, I'm not going to tell you I have the ultimate answer, but I think you're right. Just sprinkling a few women in and stirring, that doesn't really work, right? It doesn't really work. And we also know that there's plenty of psychological literature suggesting that it's only when you reach kind of a critical mass of women at the decision-making table that they have any influence at all. As you've rightly pointed out, many women who are even quote-unquote parliamentarians or members of the executive branch are only there because they're the wives or the daughters of powerful men, right? And so I don't think that it's a one-to-one correspondence between percentage of women in public positions and empowerment of women. I really don't. Yet, there is no doubt that we want women at the decision-making tables. So how do we do this? I think you actually mentioned something that I've been thinking a lot about, and that is the judiciary system. Think about everything that we've normalized. We've normalized domestic violence. We've normalized rape. We've normalized pretty much all the crimes that are steeply gendered against women. I just saw an expose by The Guardian, an important newspaper in the UK, that has basically said, look, we have, for all intents and purposes, we have decriminalized rape in the UK because of all reported rapes, only 1.5% results in a conviction of a perpetrator. So I really think that you're right in suggesting that we need to try an experiment where the judicial branch of our government is overwhelmingly female. The judges, the prosecutors, the police officers, the police detectives. Would that kind of normalization of violence against women stand if this was, in essence, the women's branch of government and not the men's branch of government? So I'm thinking the same heretical thoughts you are, because I think that by actually removing impunity for violence against women, in that case, then we start to create a society where a woman at a table means something. And maybe then, right, we can say, let's strive for a certain percentage of parliamentarians being women, and so forth. The other heretical daydream I sometimes have, and I promise you I don't use drugs, but every once in a while I have this daydream about how one day we would say, it's no true democracy without 50% representation of women in every office. So you would have 50% in Congress being women and 50% being male. You would have a dual presidency. Man and woman have to be president together and agree on the decisions. I start having these crazy daydreams about what would happen if we really, really, really made women part of the decision-making councils for humanity. I think that's probably way too out there. Maybe the judiciary is the first place to start.
Yeah.
But I think we do have to have maybe crazy dreams because we've been locked into this box where women don't matter, where crimes against women don't matter, women's voices don't matter. And somehow we have to get out of that box. And I don't know if incrementalism is always the best way to go. Is there any appetite for our plan to be put into action? No. So maybe you and I are both crazy dreamers still. But thank you for that question, Matthew.
Thank you so much.
All righty. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Maddie. I'm a political
Hi.
science major.
Great.
So I have a
By
question.
the way, you've looked at the Bush School as a possible master's degree, have you?
I'm a second year. I haven't thought that far yet.
All right, but when you get to be a junior, in fact, all of you who are interested in public service or interested in international affairs, please check out the professional master's degree programs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. We already have a Berea College student there, and he's doing terrifically well. Furthermore, the Bush School is absolutely devoted to making sure you get that master's degree without crushing debt. So look into it. I'm sorry, please, go ahead.
Okay, so in a lot of the countries that you had listed on one of the slides that had the cycle of like female suppression, so a lot of those countries don't have like a lot of rights for queer people and acceptance for queer people. How do you think that relates in terms of the rights and acceptance of queer people as well?
Oh, I'm so glad you raised that question, because when I talk about male-female relations being the first political order, I really mean that. And what I mean by that is that sex is the first major difference, with a capital D, among human beings. So you could imagine a society that has no racial differences, no ethnic differences, no language differences, no religious differences, but sex will still be there. And so the way that women are treated is the way that all others who are different will be treated, right? It becomes the template, right, for feminizing, right, treating as subordinate and justifying violence against people of a different race, people of a different sexual orientation. And so I do believe that the root of it is how we handle that original difference. And as we heal that original first political order, I think that cascades outward in a virtuous cycle. And then those old horrible templates of feminizing anyone who's different, right, will be gone as well. Thank you. That's a brilliant question.
Hello, my name is Justin, and I'm a computer science major. I have never have anything to do with politics, and which stems with my question.
I don't know. I mean, the whole Zuckerberg thing, right? You know.
I want to go into probably fiction game design, but I actually found your whole thing very interesting as a creative writer with how I do world building and stuff. But I wanted to ask, what do you think all of us should do? Those, like, not just those who are in like political science and plan on doing political things and such like that. What do you think all of us should do to try and like help improve with your ideas?
Oh, I bet I could turn that back to you. I bet you have ideas. I'm sure you have ideas, don't you? Give me an idea that you have.
Well, of course, this would have to depend on me doing well as a writer. Including your ideas in my works of fiction and showing like two different societies within that, how one's doing way better with your ideas than one who isn't.
Wonderful.
That's what I was thinking about.
Wonderful. If you create computer simulations, you can put in some of those odds ratios, right? That are true odds ratios, but are usually not included in those kinds of simulations. I think that's brilliant. I think more to the point, of course, is how you treat the women in your life, all right? Some of us are not going to end up in the State Department or the Defense Department, but we're all going to be living with women, all right? And so how do you treat women in your family? How do you treat, you know, women that you may be dating? How do you treat daughters? That is hugely important. One of the things I was talking about with the students previously in the lunchtime session was we were talking about how oftentimes what happens, I speak to you as a male, that men are very much concerned about their status within a group of male peers. And that status may come to take first priority in a man's life. And if you find that happening to you, I want you to make the choice to not have it be the first priority. Here's an example. Let's suppose you're in a group of men and there's some really nasty joke about women. Do you laugh? Yeah, you don't laugh. Now, you don't have to give them a sermon and, everybody thinks you're some sort of, virtue signaler or whatever. Just laugh as if you don't get the joke. Refuse the status points that would be given to you if you laughed. Refuse to make those jokes in the first place, right? If we could just step out of that game of getting props from other men and that being more important than being a decent guy, I think a lot of bad stuff would go away. There's plenty of other things you can do as well. If you happen to buy my book, we have an entire chapter about everything that you can do.
I plan on getting your book after this.
Oh, that's really nice. But that's a couple of thoughts for you. Thank you. I'm glad you asked that question. Yes.
Hi, my name's Samson. I'm a junior political science major. I'm going to make this really quick. Basically, how do we get more men involved in these conversations of how we can improve these problems? Because to a lot of men, it would probably be uncomfortable. Like I know in my sphere of Berea, obviously my professors do a great job of teaching about it. But outside of Berea, I feel like we can't have these, not that we can't, we don't have these conversations. So how do we get more men involved in these conversations about how to solve these issues and to make the world a better place?
Yeah, I'm a woman and I can't answer that question. But when I answered that young man, I'm challenge you as well. You know it and I know it. That male status among a group of males means a lot to you. That it's time to sit down and ask what it costs you and costs women. That status means so much to you. Are there things that you can just step out of? Say, I ain't doing it. I'm just not doing it anymore. I know it gives me points with my brothers, but I'm not going to do it. Maybe you say, I'm not going to watch porn anymore, right? Maybe you just say, I know this is bad for me, it's bad for society, and it's really bad for women, especially the women who are being beaten and slapped and choked right there for my pleasure. I ain't doing it anymore. And I don't care if that means that the other men in my group are going to think I'm some sort of wuss. I'm just not doing it anymore. So if you could interrogate yourself about how the desire for male status causes you to do things that you actually don't like, or that you like and you know you shouldn't, I think that you will help change the world. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Hudson. This concludes our convocation. Have a good day. Bye-bye.